Welcome, dear listeners, to an epic journey through the frozen fjords of the north, where the wind carries whispers of ancestors and where a young man will discover that the blood running through his veins can both bless and curse. This is the story of Eric, an ordinary boy who carries within himself the weight of a legendary lineage, a heritage that some would kill to possess and others to destroy. Between ancestral runes and choices that will define the fate of entire kingdoms, you will witness how a person's true worth lies not in their birth, but in the decisions they make when the world crumbles around them. Tell me, dear listener, from where do you watch us today? From sunny southern Brazil, from cold mountains, or perhaps from some coastal city that echoes the Nordic Sea of this story? If this narrative touches your heart as Viking sagas touched generations, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like. Each gesture of yours allows us to continue bringing stories that cross centuries to reach you. Year 967 AD, village of Skalavik, west coast of Norway. The morning mist danced over the dark waters of the fjord like ghosts of ancient navigators, and Astrid knew that would be a day marked by iron and blood. Her wrinkled but still firm fingers clutched the wool shawl over her shoulders as she watched the black sails on the horizon, 3 ships cutting through the waters with the voracity of hungry wolves. "Eric," she called, her voice carrying decades of maternal concern that crystallized in that instant. "Come inside now." The 16-year-old boy raised his head from the hammer he wielded, sweat gleaming on his forehead, despite the cold that bit the skin. There was something in his eyes, a spark that Astrid recognized and feared, that seemed to awaken whenever danger approached. It was as if the blood running through his veins whispered war songs that he himself didn't understand. "Mother, they're just 3 ships. The village men can—" "No." The word came out like a blade's cut. Astrid had survived 45 winters in these harsh lands, had seen husbands leave never to return, children grow to become shadows of themselves, but nothing had prepared her to raise a boy whose birthmarks glowed like ancestral runes whenever the moon was full. These are not common raiders. The wind brought the sound of wood cracking against wood, the hulls of the invading ships brutally kissing the beach sand. Screams echoed through the village like ravens announcing doom, and Eric felt something primitive awaken in his chest, something that made his hands tingle with thirst for battle. The raiders advanced through the village like an iron storm, their armor jingling a sinister melody against the sound of waves. They were large men, with braided beards and eyes that had seen many deaths, but it was when one of them, a giant with red hair wielding a double axe, invaded the small wooden house where Astrid and Eric were hiding, that the impossible happened. Eric moved as if an ancestral force guided his muscles. The hammer in his hands became an extension of his soul, each blow calculated with precision that only veteran warriors possessed. The raider, surprised by the resistance of a simple village youth, retreated when Eric knocked him down with a movement that seemed to have been engraved in his memory for generations. It was then that Astrid saw it. The marks on Eric's right arm, small scars she had always attributed to childhood accidents, began to glow with a ghostly blue light. They weren't scars. They were runes. Runes she knew all too well, that she had seen burn on the skin of only one man in her entire life. "No," she whispered, her voice lost in the tumult of battle. "It can't be." When the raiders finally retreated, repelled by the unexpected resistance of the small village, Astrid looked at Eric as if seeing him for the first time. The boy was panting, confused by his own strength, ignorant of the terror dancing in the eyes of the woman who had raised him. That night, while Eric slept exhausted, Astrid went to the chest buried under the kitchen floor. Her hands trembled as she removed scrolls yellowed by time, navigation maps marked with royal symbols, and a letter sealed with wax that she had never dared to open. One by one she fed the fireplace with the documents, watching 16 years of secrets transform into ashes. But she kept one thing, a gold ring with the mark of the raven, a symbol that made kings bow and enemies flee. She hid it again, whispering a prayer to the old gods. "Never let them know your true lineage, my son," she murmured to the silent night, not knowing that her words would be prophetic. "The blood of Ragnar Lothbrok is both gift and curse, and I won't live forever to protect you from both." The flames danced higher in the fireplace, as if the gods themselves approved of her decision to keep Ragnar's last son hidden from the world that would kill to possess him. The dreams began 3 nights after the attack, coming like tides that Eric couldn't contain. In them he walked through golden halls, where the echo of axes mixed with deep laughter of warriors. A blond man, with braids adorned by silver rings, extended his hand through a silver mist that smelled of pine and iron. "Blood of my blood," said the voice, deep as distant thunder. "The day will come when you must choose between what you are and what you must be." Eric would wake with the taste of mead in his mouth and an inexplicable longing for battles he had never lived. In the following mornings, he would find Astrid watching him with eyes that carried silent storms, as if she feared he might simply disappear like mist in the sun. "Tell me about my parents," he asked one morning, while repairing fishing nets beside the woman who had raised him. It was a question he asked periodically, always hoping some new detail would emerge from her memories. Astrid paused her work, fingers hesitating over the intertwined fibers. The story she told was the same as always: honest merchants killed by pirates, a baby found adrift in a drifting boat. But this time Eric noticed how she avoided his gaze, how her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "They were good," she said finally. "Your father had clear eyes like yours, and your mother." She sang as if the gods themselves listened to her. But Eric felt there was more, always more, hidden in the pauses between her words. It was during one of these melancholic mornings that a stranger arrived at the village. Björn Iron Black was a jarl who travelled with only 2 men, which was unusual for someone of his position. Tall and lean, with a scar that cut his face from temple to chin, he said he was looking for young warriors for his army. "I need men who have fire in their blood," he declared in the village's central square, his voice carrying natural authority. "Men who don't know fear when they face death." Eric felt something strange when he heard these words, a magnetic attraction, as if each cell of his body recognized an ancestral call. He approached the group that had formed around the jarl, ignoring the warning look that Astrid cast him from a distance. "And what do these warriors gain?" asked Eric, his voice sounding firmer than he expected. Björn Iron Black turned slowly, and when his eyes met Eric's, something passed between them, a mutual recognition that neither of them completely understood. The jarl studied the young man with attention that went beyond casual curiosity, noting the erect posture, the width of shoulders, the way Eric maintained eye contact without looking away. "They gain the chance to discover who they really are," replied Björn, and Eric felt these words carried hidden meanings. "Some men are born to plough fields, others are born to conquer worlds." That night, Eric couldn't sleep. He stayed on the beach, watching the stars that seemed to form runes in the dark sky, trying to decipher messages he felt were destined specifically for him. The wind carried whispers of stories he knew without ever having heard, sagas of a king who had sailed to the ends of the world, who had challenged gods and created legends that still made men kneel. Ragnar Lothbrok. The name came to him like an involuntary prayer, and Eric felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know why that name resonated in his soul like the echo of a familiar song, but he felt he was connected to it in a way that transcended simple admiration for ancient legends. When he finally returned home, he found Astrid awake, mending clothes by the light of a candle that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. "Don't trust that man," she said without raising her eyes from her work. "Some jarls seek warriors. Others seek something much more dangerous." "What could be more dangerous than war?" asked Eric, sitting beside her. Astrid finally looked at him, and Eric saw unshed tears shining in her eyes like ice in moonlight. "The truth," she whispered. "There are truths that kill more surely than any sword," but Eric already felt that, no matter how much Astrid tried to protect him, the truth was approaching like an inevitable storm, bringing with it changes that not even a mother's love could prevent. The festival of Disablot arrived with the first breath of autumn, bringing villagers from neighboring settlements to celebrate the harvest and honor the ancestors. The bonfires crackled like small earthly suns, casting golden light on faces reddened by mead and the cold wind that blew from the fjords. Eric moved among the celebrants, like someone observing the world through mist. Since Björn Iron Black's arrival, he felt divided between 2 worlds, the familiar and safe one of the village and another, wild and unknown, that called to him with ever-increasing force. It was when he saw Friday that everything changed. She was being pursued by 3 drunk men near the food stalls, her blue dress contrasting with the golden hair that fell loose over her shoulders. There was terror in her eyes, but also a wounded dignity that touched something deep in Eric's chest. "Leave her alone," he said, approaching the group with firm steps. The largest of the men, a giant with a red beard, laughed with disdain. "Go away, boy. This is not your business." "It became my business the moment you disrespected a woman in our village." Eric didn't plan what happened next. When the man advanced against him with a closed fist, His body reacted with a speed and precision that seemed to have been engraved in his soul by generations of warriors. He dodged the blow, grabbed the attacker's wrist, and, with a fluid movement that surprised even himself, threw the giant over a food table. The other two men hesitated, but when they saw their companion getting up with fury, they advanced together. Eric moved as if dancing an ancestral choreography. Each dodge, each counterattack, executed with deadly elegance that left the spectators silent. It was when his fist connected with the second attacker's chin that it happened. The marks on his right arm began to glow with a blue-silver light that seemed to come from within the skin itself. The runes pulsed like a luminous heart, and for a moment, everyone present could clearly see the symbols that formed a complex and ancient pattern. A murmur of amazement ran through the crowd. Some stepped away, making signs of protection against evil magic. Others approached, trying to understand what they had witnessed. Among them was Gunnar the Wise, a white-haired man who served as guardian of the village's memory. His eyes widened when he saw the runes, and Eric noticed how the elder paled as if he had seen a ghost. "Runes of destiny," whispered Gunnar, almost to himself. "I hadn't seen them in many years." Freydis approached Eric, her blue eyes shining with gratitude and curiosity. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft as honey but firm as steel. "I'm Freydis, daughter of Hakon." "Eric," he replied, still panting from the fight, trying to ignore the way people now watched him, no longer as the village youth they knew, but as something different, perhaps dangerous. "Those marks," began Freydis, but Astrid appeared like a storm, grabbing Eric's arm and covering the runes with her shawl. "Let's go home," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that made Eric realize something very important had happened, something he didn't completely understand. That night, after Eric fell into restless sleep, Gunnar gently knocked on Astrid's door. The conversation between them was conducted in urgent whispers on the porch, under the cold light of the stars. "Royal lineage runes," said Gunnar, his words carrying the weight of dangerous revelations. "I thought all the bearers had disappeared." "We don't know what you're talking about," lied Astrid, but her voice trembled. "Björn Ironblack is not who he claims to be," continued the elder, ignoring her denial. "There are rumors, a secret brotherhood that hunts descendants of certain lineages. They believe that as long as there is royal blood alive, the ancient powers can return." Astrid felt the world spinning around her. 16 years of carefully guarded secrets were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. "What should I do?" she asked, and for the first time in decades, her voice sounded like that of a frightened child. "Protect the boy," replied Gunnar, "because if Björn discovers what we just saw, Eric won't live to see another dawn." In the room next door, Eric pretended to sleep, but had heard every word. The pieces of a puzzle that had tormented him for years were beginning to fit together, forming an image that both terrified and fascinated him. He wasn't just Eric, the orphan raised by a kind widow. He was someone whose very blood carried secrets that powerful men would kill to possess or destroy. And now Björn Ironblack was in the village, looking for exactly someone like him. The next morning arrived wrapped in thick mist that transformed the village into a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Eric woke with his heart racing, fragments of violent dreams still echoing in his mind, visions of battles in distant lands, war cries in languages he understood without ever having learned. Astrid wasn't home when he went down to the kitchen. A bowl of still steaming porridge waited for him on the table, but her absence created a void that seemed to forebode storm. It was Freydis who brought the news. She appeared at the door like a golden apparition emerging from the mist, her eyes carrying an urgency that made Eric immediately understand something was wrong. "Björn Ironblack is summoning all the young men of the village for combat tests," she said without preamble. "Your mother went to speak with him, tried to dissuade him, but Eric—" She hesitated, biting her lower lip. "There's something strange about that man. The way he watches you, it's as if he's looking for something specific." Eric dressed in his leather tunic and tied his boots with mechanical movements, his mind spinning in circles. Part of him wanted to run, hide in the mountains until Björn left, but another part, a part that grew stronger each day, yearned for confrontation as if he needed to prove something to himself. "Where are they conducting the tests?" he asked. "On the beach. But Eric, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." His voice came out firmer than he expected. "If I hide now, I'll be hiding for the rest of my life." The beach had transformed into an improvised arena. Björn Ironblack watched from atop a rock, flanked by his two warriors, while young villagers faced each other with wooden swords. The Jarl took notes on a small scroll, his calculating eyes evaluating each movement, each demonstration of strength or skill. Eric approached the group, noticing how some of the young men were already wounded. Nothing serious, but enough to show that Björn wasn't interested in games. This was a real test, with real consequences. Our young blacksmith has arrived," announced Björn when he saw Eric. There was something in his voice, an almost satisfied tone, that made Eric feel as if he had fallen into a carefully prepared trap. "What are the rules?" asked Eric, picking up a wooden sword that was offered to him. "Simple," replied Björn, jumping from the rock with feline agility. "Fight me. If you can knock me down, you earn a place in my army. If you can't—" He smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Well, at least we'll know you're not wasting time." Eric wielded the sword, testing its weight and balance. It was different from the hammer he was used to, but felt strangely familiar in his hands, as if it were a natural extension of his arm. Björn's attack came without warning, fast, brutal, calculated to end the combat before Eric could react adequately. But Eric moved as if he knew exactly what was coming, dodging by inches and counter-attacking with a sequence of blows that made Björn retreat, surprised. "Interesting," murmured the Jarl, his eyes gleaming with something that seemed like dangerous satisfaction. "Who taught you to fight like this?" "No one," replied Eric, and it was true. He was fighting by instinct, letting something deep in his genetic memory guide his movements. The combat intensified. Björn was experienced, technically superior, but Eric had something the Jarl didn't expect, a controlled fury that seemed to fuel each movement. And then, inevitably, it happened again. The runes on his arm began to glow. This time Björn saw it. His eyes widened with recognition that was simultaneously triumphant and terrifying. Eric perceived the change in the Jarl's expression and knew with instinctive certainty that he was in mortal danger. "Stop!" Astrid's voice cut through the air like a seagull's cry. She ran across the sand, approaching the two men with evident desperation. "Eric has family commitments. He can't leave now." But Eric saw the truth in Björn's eyes. The Jarl was no longer interested in recruiting him. He was interested in something much more sinister. "Of course," said Björn softly, lowering his sword. "Family first. Always." But when he turned to leave, he whispered something that only Eric could hear. "We'll see each other again very soon, son of Ragnar." Eric's blood froze. Björn knew. Somehow the Jarl knew his true parentage. That night, Eric could barely eat. Astrid moved through the house like a lost soul, repeatedly checking windows and doors. The atmosphere was charged with tension, as if both knew something terrible was approaching. It was after midnight that they came. Eric woke to the sound of wood being forced. Low voices echoed from downstairs, accompanied by the metallic noise of weapons being unsheathed. He dressed quickly and went down the stairs, finding 3 hooded men searching the house, while Astrid was pressed against the wall, pale but defiant. "Where is it?" asked one of the invaders, his voice muffled by the mask covering his face. "I don't know what you're talking about," replied Astrid, but Eric saw how her hands trembled. "Ragnar's ring, we know you have it." Eric felt the world spinning. Ragnar's ring. How did these men know about something he himself had just discovered existed? One of the invaders approached Astrid with a dagger gleaming in his hand. Last chance. That's when Eric lost control. The fury that took hold of him wasn't human. It was something primitive, ancestral, that transformed his muscles into iron and his bones into steel. He attacked the 3 men like a personified storm, his runes glowing like embers in the darkness. The fight was brutal but quick. When it ended, the 3 invaders were unconscious on the kitchen floor, and Eric stood in the middle of the destruction, panting and terrified by his own violence. Astrid looked at him as if seeing a stranger. "My God," she whispered, "you really are." "What?" asked Eric, desperate for answers. "Astrid, for the love of Odin, tell me what I am." But before she could answer, her eyes rolled back and she collapsed to the floor. Eric ran to support her, noticing the wound on her shoulder, a cut that bled profusely, the result of a blade that had managed to reach her during the confusion. While pressing a cloth against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, Astrid whispered in a weak voice, "Find Gunnar. He knows the truth." Eric looked at the woman who had raised him, seeing her so fragile and vulnerable, and felt his life disintegrating like ancient parchment touched by fire. Everything he had believed about himself was wrong, and now dangerous men knew who he really was. War had come to his door, and Eric was beginning to understand that it wouldn't be possible to avoid it much longer. The fire in Gunnar the Wise's hearth crackled, like secrets being whispered to the winds, its flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories older than memory itself. Eric had carried Astrid through the sleeping village, his steps echoing in the silence like beats of an anxious heart. Gunnar opened the door before Eric even knocked, as if expecting them. His eyes, deep as wells of ancestral wisdom, quickly assessed Astrid's wound and Eric's desperate expression. "Bring her inside," he said simply, "and close the door tight. Tonight the shadows have ears." While the elder tended to Astrid's wound with herbs and ointments that exhaled aromas of distant forests, Eric walked nervously through the small cabin, observing the walls covered with carved runes and scrolls that seemed to guard the history of lost worlds. "Sit down," ordered Gunnar when he finished bandaging Astrid's shoulder. "Here's time for you to know some truths you've been carrying for 16 years. Eric obeyed, but his body remained tense as a bowstring ready to be released. "The men who attacked us, they knew my true name." "Not your name," corrected Gunnar, serving herbal tea in dark wooden bowls. "Your lineage? There's a significant difference between the two." The elder walked to an ornate chest in the corner of the cabin and withdrew an ancient naval map, yellowed by time, and marked with symbols that made Eric feel shivers of recognition. 16 years ago, began Gunnar, unrolling the map on the table, a ship was found adrift in the waters near our coast. It was a royal vessel, not the type merchants use, but warships decorated with gold and iron. Eric approached, studying the markings on the map. There were traced routes leading to lands he couldn't identify, and royal symbols that pulsed with hidden meaning. "Inside the ship," continued Gunnar, "there was only a baby you, wrapped in fabrics with silver threads, surrounded by objects that identified your origin as significant." "What kind of objects?" asked Eric, his voice almost a whisper. Gunnar hesitated, looking at Astrid, who remained unconscious, but with stable breathing. "A shield with royal runes, gold rings engraved with lineage symbols, and—" he paused, as if the next words were too dangerous to be spoken. "A letter sealed with the symbol of the raven." Eric felt his heart accelerate. The raven was a symbol of Odin, among other things. Gunnar approached him, studying the marks that glowed faintly on his arm. "These runes you carry aren't common, Eric. They're lineage runes, marks that appear only in those whose blood carries special memories, abilities, battle instincts, strength beyond normal, the capacity to lead men as if it were something natural." Gunnar delicately touched one of the runes. "They are gifts and curses from the gods, presents that come with a terrible price." Eric stepped away, his mind spinning with information that refused to form a complete picture. "But who were my parents? Why did they abandon me?" "You weren't abandoned," said a weak voice from the chair where Astrid rested. She had awakened, her eyes still clouded by pain, but alert enough to participate in the conversation. "You were saved." "Astrid," warned Gunnar. "Perhaps it's too early for—" "No." Astrid forced herself to sit, ignoring the visible discomfort. "He almost died today protecting me. He deserves to know at least part of the truth." She extended her hand to Eric, who approached and knelt beside the chair. "Your parents were important people, my son. So important that they had powerful enemies." "What kind of enemies?" "The kind that kills children to prevent them from growing up and claiming what is theirs by right," replied Astrid, her words carrying decades of carefully hidden fear. Eric felt as if the ground was disappearing under his feet. "So am I really of noble origin?" Gunnar and Astrid exchanged glances loaded with meaning. It was clear they knew more than they were willing to reveal. "You are a descendant of a lineage that some men would do anything to possess," said Gunnar carefully, "and others would do anything to destroy." "Björn Iron Black," whispered Eric. "He knows, doesn't he?" "Björn is just a pawn," replied Astrid bitterly. "There are greater forces in motion, Eric. Forces that have been looking for you since the day you were born." Eric stood abruptly, walking to the window and observing the silent village bathed in moonlight. "Then I can't stay here. My presence puts everyone in danger." "Where would you go?" asked Gunnar. "These people will find you wherever you are. The only real protection is ignorance, pretending to be just Eric, the orphan blacksmith." "But now they know," said Eric, turning to face the two adults who had kept his secrets for so long. "Björn saw the runes. The men who attacked us knew my true parentage. The disguise is over." Astrid closed her eyes, silent tears running down her face. 16 years, she murmured. 16 years of peace. "And now?" asked Eric. Gunnar approached the window, watching the shadows that seemed to move with their own life among the village houses. "Now, young man, you must decide who you want to be. The safe boy we raised with such care, or the man your blood is destined to become. Eric touched the runes on his arm, feeling the heat they emanated, as if they were small suns buried under his skin. And if I choose to be who my blood demands I be? Then, said Gunnar gravely, may the gods have mercy on all of us, because you will carry a burden that has destroyed men better than any of us. But even as he spoke, Eric knew the choice had already been made the moment the runes first glowed. It was no longer about whether he would become what he was destined to be, but when and what price he would pay for the transformation. Dawn arrived pale and hesitant, as if the sun itself feared revealing the secrets the night had whispered. Eric hadn't been able to sleep. He had stayed at Gunnar's window, watching the shadows, looking for suspicious movement among the silent houses of the village. It was when he saw the smoke that he knew his worst fears had materialized. His house, the house where he had grown up, where Astrid had fed and protected him for 16 years, was in flames. Orange flames licked the morning sky like demonic tongues, and the wind carried the smell of burned wood, mixed with something more sinister. "No," he whispered, but Gunnar was already at his side, a firm hand on his shoulder. "It was inevitable," said the elder. "They came looking for clues, and when they didn't find what they were seeking—" "The ring," murmured Astrid, who had approached despite her weakness. "They were looking for Ragnar's ring." Eric turned sharply. "What ring? What are you talking about?" Astrid exchanged a meaningful look with Gunnar before walking to her bag and withdrawing an object wrapped in dark fabric. When she unwrapped it, Eric saw a gold ring that seemed to pulse with its own light. The piece was ornamented with complex runes and had a raven engraved in the center. Not a common raven, but the representation of Hugin or Munin, Odin's ravens. "This ring belonged to—" Astrid hesitated, as if the following words were too dangerous to be spoken. "It belonged to your true father." Eric extended his hand with reverence, touching the metal that felt hot as if it had just come from a forge. The moment his fingers came into contact with the gold, visions exploded in his mind. Viking ships cutting unknown oceans, epic battles in distant lands, a blond man with blue eyes commanding armies as if he were a god of war. "Ragnar Lothbrok," whispered Eric, and it wasn't a question. The silence that followed was answer enough. "Am I the son of Ragnar Lothbrok?" The question came out like a lament, loaded with disbelief and terror. "Last son," confirmed Gunnar gravely. "Born from his final union, hidden when enemies approached to exterminate his entire lineage." Eric felt the world spinning around him. Ragnar Lothbrok, the most legendary Viking king, whose deeds were sung in sagas throughout Scandinavia. A man who had sailed to England, attacked Paris, challenged Christian and pagan kings alike. "But he is dead," said Eric, searching for some logic amid the chaos of revelations. "Dead, yes," agreed Astrid, "but his lineage. His lineage carries powers that some desperately want to possess and others want to completely destroy." It was then that Freydis appeared at Gunnar's cabin door, panting, as if she had run a great distance. Her golden hair was loose and disheveled, and there was panic in her blue eyes. "Eric," she said, struggling to catch her breath, "you need to leave the village, now." "What happened?" he asked, though he already knew the news would be terrible. "Björn didn't leave as we expected. He brought more men during the night. Hooded men who call themselves the Brotherhood of Shadows." Freydis looked around nervously, as if expecting enemies to emerge from the very walls. "They're interrogating everyone in the village, looking for any information about you." Gunnar cursed in an ancient tongue. "The Brotherhood of Shadows? I thought it was just a legend." "Legend?" asked Eric. "A secret society," explained the elder, his voice loaded with genuine fear. "They say it was formed after Ragnar's death, composed of men who feared the return of his lineage. They believe that as long as there is Ragnar's blood alive, the ancient powers can return and threaten the established order." "What order?" Eric was struggling to process so much information at once. "The Christian order," replied Astrid bitterly. "Kings who converted, jarls who abandoned the old ways. To them you represent a return to the pagan past, to the old gods, to the ancient traditions of conquest and navigation." Freydis approached Eric, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "I have horses hidden in the woods. We can leave now, before they find you." "Where to?" asked Eric. "If this brotherhood really exists, there will be no safe place." "There is one place," said Gunnar slowly. "In the northern mountains lives a Völva, a wise witch who knows the ancient ways. If anyone can help you understand your destiny and protect you from enemies—" "No," interrupted Astrid firmly. Velvers are dangerous. They speak in riddles and charge terrible prices for their knowledge. And what's the alternative? Asked Eric. Stay here and wait for them to capture me. Run like a coward for the rest of my life. Astrid looked at the young man she had raised, seeing in him traces of the man she had once loved and feared equally. If you choose this path, my son, there will be no return. Once you embrace your true nature, there's already no return, said Eric with certainty that surprised him. The moment the runes glowed, my destiny was sealed. He placed Ragnar's ring on his finger, feeling the metal adjust perfectly, as if it had been forged specifically for him. Power coursed through his bones like liquid fire, and for a moment Eric understood what it meant to carry the blood of kings. Very well, he said, turning to Freydis. Take me to those horses, but first, he looked at Astrid and Gunnar. You two are coming with us. If you stay here, the Brotherhood will use you to get to me. Astrid began to protest, but stopped upon seeing the expression on Eric's face. He was no longer the boy she had raised. He was something new, something dangerous and powerful that was just beginning to emerge. So be it, she whispered. May the gods forgive us for all that's to come. From outside, the shouts of men interrogating villagers echoed through the morning like ravens announcing storm. War had come to the small village, and Eric knew that wherever he went from that moment on, violence would follow him like a shadow. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel fear. He felt something much more dangerous. He felt hunger to discover exactly what he was capable of. The mountains rose before them like teeth of sleeping giants, their faces covered with snow that gleamed with silver light under the pale autumn sun. Eric rode in silence, Ragnar's ring weighing on his finger like a constant reminder of the burden he carried, while the small group climbed trails that seemed to have been opened by the gods themselves. 3 days had passed since they fled the village. 3 days of forced rides, sleeping under the stars and eating only what they could hunt along the way. Astrid, still weak due to her wound, struggled to stay firm in the saddle, but her eyes remained alert, constantly watching the rear for signs of pursuit. Freydis rode beside Eric, and he had noticed how she seemed to know these trails better than would be expected of a young village girl. There were moments when she took the lead, guiding them through shortcuts that avoided the main paths, as if she had traveled these mountains before. How much farther? Asked Gunnar, his voice hoarse from exertion. The elder wasn't accustomed to long rides, and the altitude was beginning to affect his breathing. Not much, replied Freydis, pointing to a peculiar rock formation high on the mountain. The Völva lives in a cave behind that waterfall. They say the place is protected by ancient magic. Eric observed the formation she had indicated and felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something about that place that resonated with the runes on his arm, as if they recognized a similar power. It was when they reached the first of the stone markers that Eric understood they were approaching truly dangerous territory. The rocks were arranged in circular patterns, engraved with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own life. Even the horses seemed nervous, neighing softly and resisting to advance. Protection runes, murmured Gunnar, examining the symbols with respect mixed with fear. Ancient, very ancient. Protection against what? Asked Eric. Against those who are not worthy to receive knowledge, replied a voice that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. The group turned abruptly, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one visible. It was then that she emerged from the mist like an apparition, a woman of indefinable age, with white hair that fell to her waist and eyes that seemed to contain the wisdom of centuries. The Völva wore clothes made of furs and fabrics that gleamed with intertwined metallic threads, and carried a staff ornamented with bones and stones that jingled softly with each movement. Around her neck, necklaces of animal teeth and runic amulets created a sinister melody. Ragnar's blood walks among the living again, she said, but not in Norse, in an even more ancient tongue that Eric understood perfectly, as if he had known it since birth. You know who I am? Asked Eric, dismounting slowly. The Völva smiled, revealing teeth that gleamed like pearls in the darkness of her mouth. I know who you were, who you are, and who you can become. The question is, are you prepared to know all these truths? Eric looked back at Astrid, who watched him with evident concern, at Gunnar, who made signs of protection against evil magic, at Freydis, who seemed tense as a bowstring. Then he returned his eyes to the Völva. I am. Then come, but know that true knowledge always demands payment. And the price for knowing what you carry in your blood may be higher than you imagine. The Völva's cave was a natural cathedral illuminated by crystals that emanated their own light. The walls were covered with runes carved into living rock, and the air smelled of burned herbs and incense that made Eric's mind feel strangely expanded. In the center of the cave, a circle of runic stones was arranged around a bowl of dark metal filled with water that reflected images that didn't correspond to the reality of the cave. "Extend your arm," ordered the vulva, withdrawing a small crystal blade from her garments. Eric hesitated only for a moment before obeying. The cut was quick and superficial, but when his blood dripped into the water, the runes around the cave exploded in blinding light. The visions began immediately. Eric saw himself in a great golden hall, where warriors drank mead from ornamented horns. A blond man seated on an iron throne watched him with eyes that were mirrors of his own. Ragnar Lothbrok wasn't just a legend. He was real, alive in the visions, extending his hand to Eric across time. "Blood of my blood," said Ragnar's vision. "You were born at the end of an era, but you can be the beginning of another. The power you carry can raise kingdoms, or destroy them completely." The visions changed, showing him armies marching under his command, ships cutting unknown oceans, cities bowing before his strength. But then the images darkened, revealing fields covered with bodies, destroyed families, kingdoms in flames. "Ragnar's blood is both gift and curse," continued the ancestral voice. "Power without measure, but an insatiable thirst for more power. Conquest without end, but eternal solitude. This is the price of greatness." Eric tried to move away from the bowl, but discovered he couldn't move. The visions continued, showing him two possible paths for his future. One led to glory and destruction, another to peace and insignificance. "Choose," whispered the vulva, her voice echoing in the cave like a divine command. "But remember, once the choice is made, there is no return." The vision stopped abruptly, leaving Eric panting and disoriented. The vulva watched him with eyes that seemed to see directly through his soul. "What did you see?" she asked. I saw two destinies. In one I become like Ragnar, powerful but destructive. In the other, you remain human," completed the vulva. "But you know your enemies will never cease seeking you. The Brotherhood of Shadows doesn't stop until all of Ragnar's lineage is extinct." Eric touched the runes on his arm, which still glowed faintly after the visions. "Then I don't really have a choice, do I?" "There is always choice," said the vulva, "but some choices require that you be willing to lose everything you believe about yourself." When they emerged from the cave, the sun was setting, painting the mountains with tones of gold and red that reminded Eric of the battle visions he had just witnessed. Astrid approached him immediately, studying his expression with worried eyes. "What did she show you?" she asked. Eric looked at the woman who had raised him, at the elder who had guarded his secrets, at the young woman who had risked her life to help him. "She showed me that the boy you knew is dying, and that the man I must become might be a stranger to all of us." Astrid touched his face with infinite tenderness. "Whatever you're destined to be, my son, always remember that you were raised with love." That must mean something. But Eric already felt the change beginning in his blood, an awakening that couldn't be contained much longer. He looked at the mountains around and knew that when he descended from them, he would be a different man. The question that tormented him was, would he be better or worse? The descent from the mountains took 2 days, and Eric noticed how each step brought them closer, not only to civilization, but also to danger. The runes on his arm pulsed constantly now, as if sensing the proximity of enemies, and he discovered he could hear sounds the others didn't perceive, the distant galloping of horses, the almost imperceptible jingling of armor. Freydis rode closer to him now, and Eric found comfort in her presence. There was something about her that calmed him, perhaps the way she watched him without fear, as if she saw in him not a monster in formation, but simply a young man carrying a burden too heavy. "Tell me about your family," he said, when they stopped to rest near a crystalline stream. It was an attempt at normal conversation, a moment of humanity amid the chaos his life had become. Freydis hesitated, playing with a lock of golden hair between her fingers. "There isn't much to tell. I lost my parents when I was a child. I lived with my uncle until recently." "What happened to him?" "He died in a territorial dispute. Nothing dramatic, just—" She paused, as if searching for the right words. "Sometimes life simply takes from us those we love." Eric noticed she avoided details, but attributed this to the natural pain of painful memories. There were other things on his mind, mainly the growing sensation that they were being followed. It was when they made camp that night that everything fell apart. Eric woke to the sound of branches being stepped on in the forest around the camp. His runes glowed with intensity he had never experienced before, and instinctively he knew danger was imminent. "Astrid," he whispered, gently shaking the woman who slept near the dying fire. "Gunnar, wake up." But it was too late. Björn Black emerged from the shadows like a materialized demon, accompanied by 6 hooded men who moved with the deadly precision of the Brotherhood of Shadows. Their weapons gleamed in the light of the embers, and Eric could see they hadn't come to capture him alive. "Finally," said Björn, his voice carrying sinister satisfaction. "The last son of Ragnar, delivered like a gift." Eric rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the sword he carried. "How did you find us?" It was then he saw the expression on Freydis's face, not terror but something much worse. Guilt. "Freydis." His voice came out like a lament. She stood, moving away from him with careful movements. "I'm sorry, Eric. I really am." The betrayal hit Eric with physical force. He felt as if he had taken a blow to the chest, air leaving his lungs in a painful explosion. You're one of them." "I'm a survivor," she replied, but there were tears in her eyes. "The Brotherhood killed my family when I was 12 years old. They said they would spare me if I served them, if I found descendants of royal lineages and delivered them." "How many?" asked Eric, his voice strangely calm. "How many like me did you deliver to them?" Freydis closed her eyes. "You're the 5th. The fury that seized Eric wasn't human. It was something ancestral, primitive, that transformed his vision into a red mist of violence. The runes on his arm exploded in blinding light, and he felt strength flowing through his muscles like molten lava. "Eric, no!" shouted Astrid, but her voice seemed to come from far away. The Brotherhood men attacked simultaneously, but Eric moved as if dancing a choreography engraved in his blood by 1,000 generations of warriors. His sword cut through the air with supernatural speed, finding flesh and bone with deadly precision. The first attacker fell before even understanding what had happened. The second managed to raise his weapon before Eric's blade found his neck. The third and fourth came together, but Eric dodged their blows as if he could see the future, counter-attacking with force that sent both flying against the trees. Björn watched the carnage with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Yes," he whispered, "you really are Ragnar's son. But that won't save you." He advanced against Eric with the skill of a veteran warrior, but even his experience was no match for the berserker fury that had taken hold of the young man. They fought among the trees, their blades creating sparks in the darkness, until Eric managed to disarm Björn and knock him to the ground. With the tip of his sword at the Jarl's neck, Eric felt a bloodthirst that terrified him. It would be so easy to end it all, cut the throat of the man who had hunted his family for generations. "Eric, stop!" Freydis's voice cut through the mist of violence in his mind. "If you kill him now, you'll become exactly the monster they say you are." Eric looked at her, at the woman who had betrayed him, but whose eyes now shone with something that seemed genuinely love. "Why do you care?" "Because in these last days, seeing who you really are, not what your blood makes you be, She swallowed hard. "I fell in love with you." "Lies," growled Björn from the ground. "She's a trained spy. Every word she speaks is calculated to—" "Shut up," said Eric, pressing the sword more firmly against the Jarl's neck, but his eyes remained fixed on Freydis. "Is it true?" Tears ran freely down her face now. "I started following orders, but Eric, the man I met these days who protected Astrid, who showed kindness even when discovering terrible truths about himself, that man isn't the monster the Brotherhood taught me to fear." Eric felt the berserker fury beginning to diminish, replaced by an emotional confusion that was almost worse. "How can I trust you after—" "You can't," she admitted, "but I can try to earn that trust back." Astrid approached cautiously, watching Eric with concern. The wound on her shoulder had opened again during the fight, and she pressed a cloth against the bleeding. "My son," she said softly, "we need to leave. Other Brotherhood members may be on their way." Eric looked at Björn, who watched him with pure hatred in his eyes. "Why do you hunt us with such determination? What do you fear we'll do?" "They fear you'll claim what is yours by right," replied Björn with contempt. "They fear that Ragnar's blood will awaken and demand vengeance for all who were killed. And if I don't want vengeance—" Björn laughed with bitterness. "Ragnar's blood always wants vengeance. It's its nature. It's its curse." Eric moved the sword away from the Jarl's neck and took a step back. Maybe it's time to break that curse. But even as he spoke, he felt a part of himself whispering that Björn was right, that vengeance was in his blood like a thirst that could never be quenched. The question was whether he would be strong enough to resist this nature, or if he would eventually surrender to it. He looked at Freydis, seeing the cautious hope in her eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. "Come with us," he said. "Prove you've changed. Prove I can trust you." It was a risky bet, but Eric was beginning to understand that every meaningful choice in his life would be a risky bet. The group traveled in tense silence for 2 days after the confrontation with Björn. Eric had tied up the Jarl and decided to take him as a prisoner, ignoring Astrid's protests about the imprudence of keeping such a dangerous enemy alive. There was something about Björn, some crucial information the man possessed, that Eric felt was vital to completely understand the threat they faced. Freydis rode at the rear of the group, maintaining respectful distance from the others. Eric noticed how she avoided conversation, how her eyes remained downcast whenever he looked at her. Guilt weighed on her like a heavy cloak, and part of him felt cruel satisfaction from this. But another part, the part that remembered how she had risked her own life to warn him about the Brotherhood, fought against the desire to forgive her completely. It was when they reached the ruins of what had once been a Christian monastery that the final truth came to light. The broken stones scattered across the clearing like torn teeth, covered with moss and vines that slowly reclaimed them for nature. In the center of the ruins, a stone cross remained standing, cracked but resistant, symbolizing the struggle between old beliefs and new ones. "This place," murmured Gunnar, dismounting and examining the ruins with academic interest. "It was attacked by Vikings decades ago. I recognize the signs." Björn, whose hands remained tied but who could still speak, let out a bitter laugh. "It wasn't attacked by common Vikings, old man. It was destroyed by direct order of Ragnar Lothbrok." Eric turned sharply. "Lies." "Inconvenient truth," replied Björn. "Your precious father wasn't the noble hero the sagas make him seem. He was a brutal killer who destroyed anything that threatened his power. Monasteries, villages, entire families." "Stop talking," warned Eric, but his voice trembled with an emotion he couldn't identify. 20 Christian monks were killed here," continued Björn relentlessly. "Unarmed men who offered no resistance. Ragnar killed them personally, then burned their bodies as an offering to Odin." "Don't listen to this," said Astrid firmly, approaching Eric. "He's trying to poison your mind against—" "Against what?" interrupted Eric. "Against the truth." It was then that Freydis spoke, her voice barely audible. "He's not lying." Everyone turned to her. There was something in her expression, a painful resolution, that made Eric understand more revelations were coming. "How can you know this?" he asked. Freydis breathed deeply, as if preparing for a dive into icy waters. "Because my family, my real family, were the guardians of this monastery." The silence that followed was deafening. "My parents were converted Christians who protected the monks," she continued, her words coming out in a painful flow. "When Ragnar arrived with his men, they tried to negotiate. They offered treasure, supplies, anything to spare innocent lives." Eric felt the world beginning to spin around him. "And Ragnar killed them too. My parents, my brothers, everyone who tried to protect this place." Tears ran freely down Freydis's face now. "I was 5 years old. I hid in the ruins for 3 days before someone found me." "So when the Brotherhood approached you," began Eric, understanding the terrible irony of the situation, "when they told me there were descendants of Ragnar alive, that I could help ensure they paid for their father's crimes." Freydis met his eyes. It seemed like justice. Eric stepped away from her, walking to the cracked cross in the center of the ruins. He touched the cold stone, imagining the men who had died there, killed by his father, the man whose blood ran through his veins. "How many places like this exist?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. "Dozens," replied Björn, with cruel satisfaction. "Your father left a trail of blood across all of Scandinavia. That's why the Brotherhood exists, to ensure Ragnar's lineage can never repeat these atrocities." Eric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of crimes he hadn't committed but carried in his blood. "What if I'm different? What if I can choose a different path?" "You can try," said Björn, "but blood always speaks louder than intentions. When the berserker fury takes you completely, when the power of your lineage awakens fully, you'll be as much a monster as your father." It was at that moment Eric felt it, a physical change in his body, as if something dormant was finally awakening. The runes on his arm began to glow with intensity that made eyes water, and he felt strength flowing through his muscles like never before. "Eric," said Astrid with concern, noticing the transformation. "What's happening?" He looked at his hands and saw they trembled, not from fear, but from contained power. When he raised his eyes, the world seemed different, clearer, more intense. He could hear each person's heart beating like war drums. "The inheritance is awakening," whispered Gunnar, with a mixture of fascination and terror. "Ragnar's blood is claiming its heir." Eric turned to Björn, and the Jarl instinctively stepped back, seeing the change in his eyes. "You wanted to see the monster I carry in my blood, Eric?" "No," pleaded Freydis. "Don't prove they were right about you." But Eric could barely hear her through the roar of power filling his mind. For a terrible moment he understood exactly what Björn meant about Ragnar's blood. He felt the thirst for conquest, the hunger for domination, the primitive need to prove his strength through violence. It would be so easy, so satisfying. Killing Björn would be just the beginning. He could gather armies, conquer kingdoms, make the world bow before his power as it had bowed before his father. It was Astrid's hand on his arm that brought him back. The gentle touch of the woman who had raised him, who had loved him unconditionally for 16 years, cut through the mist of power like light-piercing darkness. "Remember who you chose to be," she whispered. "Not who your blood says you must be." Eric looked at her, at the wrinkled face that had been his first vision of human love, and felt the berserker fury gradually diminish. The power was still there, pulsing like a secondary heart, but now it was under his control. "I am not my father," he said, turning to Björn, "and I'm going to prove it." But even as he spoke, a part of him whispered that the real battle was just beginning. Ragnar's blood had awakened, and maintaining his humanity in the face of such power would be the fight of his life, a fight Eric wasn't sure he could win. The forest north of the monastery ruins stretched like a dark green sea, its intertwined branches creating a canopy so dense that even during the day sunlight reached the forest floor in fragmented golden rays. It was in this wild depth that Eric hoped to find others like him, if they really existed. Gunnar had suggested they search for descendants of Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, renowned brothers who, according to legends, had also left heirs hidden throughout the world. If the Brotherhood of Shadows really hunted all the lineage of the great Vikings, then perhaps these descendants could form an alliance against the common enemy. Björn remained as a prisoner, but Eric had noticed the Jarl watched him with a different expression now, no longer pure contempt, but something close to cautious respect. The demonstration of power at the ruins had changed the dynamic between them, though Eric wasn't sure if this was positive or negative. "How do we know these other descendants really exist?" asked Freydis, as they rode along the narrow trail that wound between ancient trees. She had gradually approached the group in recent days, though still maintaining respectful distance from Eric. "Royal lineages leave marks," replied Gunnar, consulting an ancient map he constantly pulled from his bag. "Birth runes, unusual abilities, resistance to certain diseases. Those who know what to look for can identify them." It was when they reached the isolated cabin that Eric understood they weren't the only ones searching for lost descendants. The wooden structure was hidden in a clearing so small it would easily be overlooked by normal travelers, but smoke rose from its chimney, and horses grazed in a small pasture fenced by fallen logs. More significantly, Eric could see runic symbols discreetly carved into the window frames. "Someone else is here," he murmured, his runes beginning to pulse gently, as if recognizing similar power nearby. They dismounted cautiously, keeping hands near weapons, but not openly wielding them. Eric approached the cabin door, feeling something familiar in the atmosphere, an energy that resonated with his own blood. The door opened before he knocked. The woman who appeared in the threshold was tall and slender, with red hair braided with silver threads and green eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world. There were scars on her exposed arms, not battle wounds, but deliberate marks that formed complex runic patterns. "Eric Ragnarsson," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Finally. You know me." "I know your blood," she replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "I am Sigrid, daughter of Ivar the Boneless, and these," she gestured to two men who rose from chairs near the fireplace, "are my companions in survival." The first man was gigantic, with muscles that seemed carved from stone and a black beard that reached his chest. Runes glowed faintly on his neck, and Eric could feel the power emanating from him like heat from a forge. "Magnus Ubbason," the giant introduced himself, his voice deep as distant thunder, "last son of Ubba the Terrible." The second man was smaller, younger, with blonde hair and blue eyes that painfully reminded Eric of his own visions of Ragnar. "And I am Eirik Bjornsson, grandson of Björn Ironside." Eric felt a shock run through his body. "Björn Ironside. Then you are Ragnar's grandson as well," confirmed Eric with an ironic smile. On the side, we're cousins. The revelation hit Eric like a hammer. He wasn't alone. There were others carrying the same burden, facing the same dangers. How did you find each other? Asked Astrid, observing the group with a mixture of fascination and concern. The Brotherhood of Shadows doesn't hunt only you, explained Sigrid, serving mead in wooden bowls. In recent years, they've intensified their activities. We began receiving messages from each other, warnings, calls for help. Magnus took a sip of mead before continuing. We realized that separately we're easy targets. Together, well, maybe we have a chance. How many more exist? Asked Eric. Few, admitted Eirik. Most lineages were extinguished over the centuries. We're probably the last. Sigrid approached Eric, studying the runes on his arm with professional interest. Your marks are different from ours. More intense. Eric allowed her to examine the runes, noticing how they glowed brighter when she touched them. The Völva in the mountains said, I carry both gift and curse. All lineages carry that, said Magnus gravely. But Ragnar's direct line, there's power in it that others don't possess. What kind of power? Asked Freydis, speaking for the first time since they arrived. The three descendants exchanged meaningful glances. It was Sigrid who answered. Power to command men as if it were natural, strength that goes beyond the physical, and, she hesitated, the berserker fury, the ability to transform into something that's no longer completely human during battle. Eric felt a shiver run down his spine. Do you also experience this? To lesser degrees, admitted Eric, but you carry the direct lineage. In you, these abilities are magnified, which means you're both our greatest hope and our greatest danger, added Magnus with brutal honesty. Björn, who had remained silent throughout the entire conversation, let out a bitter laugh from his corner where he was tied. Look at that, a family reunion of the cursed. Sigrid turned to him with eyes that glowed like embers. And who is this? Björn Ironblack, replied Eric, leader of the Brotherhood of Shadows. The atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly. Magnus and Eric stood, hands moving to their weapons, while Sigrid assumed a stance that seemed prepared for both magic and physical combat. You brought one of the hunters to our refuge? Asked Magnus, his voice loaded with disbelief and anger. He has information we need, explained Eric. About the Brotherhood's extent, their plans, maybe even about where to find our ancestors' artifacts. Artifacts? Asked Sigrid, sudden interest replacing hostility. Eric touched Ragnar's ring on his finger. Astrid kept this. If other objects of power exist, they do, confirmed Eric. Ragnar's sword, his crown, Ivar's axe. Legends say that together these artifacts could restore the power of our lineages, or destroy anyone foolish enough to try using them all, warned Björn from his corner. There are reasons they were separated and hidden. Eric looked at his newly discovered relatives, seeing in them the same determination he felt growing in his own chest. So we have a choice. We can continue hiding, living as fugitives, waiting for the Brotherhood to eventually find us and kill us one by one. Or, asked Sigrid, or we can take the offensive, find the artifacts, gather our strength, and end this war once and for all. The silence that followed was dense with possibilities and dangers. Eric knew he was proposing something that could save them or destroy them completely. But for the first time since discovering his true identity, he didn't feel alone. The map that Björn finally revealed under pressure was a labyrinth of ancient symbols drawn on parchment that seemed to have been made from human skin. Eric tried not to think too much about that possibility while studying the markings that indicated the location of Odin's lost temple. It's hidden on an island in the middle of Lake Mälaren, explained Björn, his voice carrying a mixture of reluctance and inevitability. The temple was built before Christianization, when the old gods still walked among men. Sigrid traced the runes on the map with a careful finger. These markings are magical protections. Whoever built this place didn't want it to be found easily. Or for whoever found it to leave alive, added Magnus grimly. The group had departed from the cabin 3 days earlier, riding north through forests that became denser and more ancient with each kilometer. Eric noticed how the very atmosphere seemed to change. The air became heavier, charged with energy that made his runes pulse constantly. Freydis rode beside him now, the distance between them gradually diminishing since the other descendants had accepted her presence. Are you worried about what we'll find there? She asked. Worried isn't the right word, replied Eric, watching the sky darken with stormy clouds. It's more anxiety, as if I'm about to discover something about myself that I can no longer ignore. Eirik, who rode nearby, heard the conversation. Artifacts of power change those who touch them, he said. My grandfather told stories about warriors who found ancient weapons and were never the same men again. How did they change? Asked Eric. Some became invincible in battle, but lost the ability to feel any emotion besides fury. Others gained deep wisdom but went mad with the weight of knowledge. Eric paused, studying Eric with worried eyes. And some simply disappeared, as if they had transformed into something that was no longer human. When they finally reached Lake Malerin, Eric understood why the temple had remained hidden for so many centuries. The water's surface was covered by a dense mist that seemed to have its own life, moving in patterns that defied natural wind. In the center of the lake, a rocky island rose like a gigantic claw emerging from the depths. How are we going to get there? Asked Astrid, observing the water with suspicion. I don't see any boat. It was Gunnar who found the answer. Here, he said, pointing to stones arranged in a specific pattern near the shore, a runic circle of invocation. Sigrid approached, examining the symbols carved into the stones. It's a transport portal. Ancient magic, very dangerous. Dangerous how? Asked Magnus. If we don't have enough royal blood to activate the mechanism, or if someone in the group isn't worthy to enter the temple. She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Eric touched Ragnar's ring, feeling the metal warm against his skin. Then let's find out if we're worthy. The group positioned itself in the center of the runic circle, with Eric, Sigrid, Magnus and Eirik at the cardinal points. When each of them pressed a drop of blood to the corresponding runes, the magic awakened with force that made the air vibrate like a harp string. The sensation of transport was like being hurled through a tunnel of liquid light. Eric felt his body dissolve and recompose instantly, and when the light faded, they were on the island. The temple rose before them like a monument to the age of gods. Built entirely of black stone that gleamed with golden veins, its architecture defied human understanding. Impossible arches curved in the air without visible support, and man-sized runes pulsed on the walls like gigantic hearts. The gods really walked here, whispered Gunnar with reverence. The temple entrance was guarded by two statues of Odin, one showing him as a wise king, the other as a fierce warrior. Between them, solid gold doors stood open, revealing a corridor that extended into darkness. Someone arrived here before us, observed Magnus, noticing recent footprints in the dust covering the stone steps. Eric felt a shiver of apprehension. The Brotherhood. Björn, who had remained silent throughout the transport, finally spoke. Not all the Brotherhood obeys me blindly. Some members have their own ambitions. Before anyone could ask what that meant, sounds of fighting echoed from inside the temple. Shouts of men, the clashing of steel against steel, and something more, a roar that didn't seem completely human. They're fighting something in there, said Eric, drawing his sword. Or someone, corrected Sigrid, preparing to conjure protective magic. Eric naturally took the lead, his runes glowing like torches in the growing darkness. Stay together. If the artifacts are really here, we won't be the only ones willing to kill for them. The temple's interior was a labyrinth of corridors and chambers, each decorated with murals telling stories of primordial times. Eric saw representations of Ragnar fighting dragons, sailing seas teeming with monsters, receiving blessings directly from Odin. It was in the central chamber that they found both the invaders and the treasures they sought. 3 men from the Brotherhood of Shadows were fighting animated guardians, skeletons of Viking warriors, moving with supernatural purpose, wielding weapons that glowed with blue fire. In the center of the chamber, on a black stone altar, rested the artifacts. Ragnar's sword, his crown, Ivar's axe, and other objects of power that made the air vibrate with magical energy. "Kill the living," roared one of the skeleton guardians, noticing Eric's group's arrival. "Protect the sacred." The battle that followed was chaotic and brutal. Eric found himself fighting side by side with Brotherhood enemies against the Guardians, an irony that didn't go unnoticed. But everyone knew the Guardians were the most immediate threat. It was when Eric finally reached the altar that he understood the true nature of the test. The artifacts weren't simply placed there. They were waiting for someone worthy to wield them. When his fingers touched the hilt of Ragnar's sword, visions exploded in his mind. He saw epic battles, impossible conquests, and also, horrifyingly, he saw the atrocities his father had committed. The destroyed monastery, the massacred families, enemies tortured for pure pleasure. "Do you accept the complete burden?" asked a voice that seemed to come from the sword itself. "The power and responsibility? The glory and guilt?" Eric looked around the chamber, at his allies fighting desperately, at Friday who watched him with fear and hope, at Astrid, who had risked everything to protect him. "I accept," he whispered, "but with one condition." "Which?" "That the power be used to protect, not to conquer, to create, not to destroy." The sword blazed with blinding light, and Eric felt power like he had never experienced flow through his bones. But this time the power came with control, with purpose, with responsibility. When the light faded, the Guardians had stopped fighting. They bowed before Eric, as if recognizing a legitimate master. But the real surprise came when one of the Brotherhood members removed his hood, revealing a face that made Eric stagger. The man was older, with graying hair and scars that told stories of 1,000 battles. But his eyes were identical to Eric's, and the runes glowing on his arms formed familiar patterns. "Hello, brother," said the stranger. "My name is Hakon, and I too am a son of Ragnar Lothbrok." The silence in the temple chamber was deafening. Eric held Ragnar's sword, still feeling the ancestral power pulsing through the blade, while staring at the man who claimed to be his brother. Hakon stood surrounded by the bodies of defeated Guardians, his own sword dripping a substance that gleamed like liquid silver. "Impossible," whispered Astrid, her hands trembling as she observed the newcomer. "All of Ragnar's sons were given as dead." Hakon approached slowly, his boots echoing on the temple stones like heartbeats. "Not all, dear Astrid. You should know. It was you who helped me escape when the Brotherhood came for the first time 30 years ago." Eric felt the world spinning. "Astrid, you know this man." The woman who had raised him closed her eyes, silent tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. "Hakon was my first adopted son, before you. I thought the Brotherhood had found him and killed me?" Hakon laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. "No, my dear adoptive mother. They recruited me." The revelation hit Eric like a physical blow. "You joined our enemies? Our enemies?" Hakon wielded his sword, pointing it at Eric. "Little brother, you understand nothing about what it means to carry Ragnar's blood. I've lived with this burden for 40 years. I've seen what it does to a man." Sigrid, Magnus and Eirik positioned themselves defensively around Eric, but he raised a hand, asking them to wait. There was something in Hakon's voice, a deep pain that Eric recognized in himself. "Tell me," said Eric simply. Hakon walked to the altar, reverently touching Ivar's axe. "When I was young like you, I believed I could use our ancestral power for good. I gathered an army, conquered 3 kingdoms, brought peace through force. And what happened? Ragnar's blood knows no satisfaction," replied Hakon bitterly. "Each victory only fed the hunger for more conquests. Each defeated enemy became justification to find new enemies. In 10 years I had become exactly like our father, a tyrant who left only ashes wherever he passed." Eric felt a shiver run down his spine. "But you chose to stop." "I didn't choose," corrected Hakon. "I was forced to stop when I realized I had ordered the execution of an entire village, including children, simply because they refused to submit to my rule." The silence that followed was loaded with horror. Eric looked at the sword in his hands, feeling the power pulsing through it, and for the first time truly understood the weight of the Volva's warning. "It was then that the Brotherhood found me," continued Hakon, "but not as enemies, as saviors. They offered me a way to use my curse for a greater purpose, to prevent others from making the same mistakes." "By killing innocent descendants," said Friday with indignation. Hakon turned to her, his eyes shining with deep sadness. "Innocent? Little one, there is no innocence in Ragnar's blood, only power waiting to corrupt." "You're wrong," said Eric firmly. "I can feel the power, yes, but I can also control it." "For how long?" asked Hakon challengingly. "A week, a month, a year. Blood is patient, brother. It whispers justifications, offers rationalizations, until one day you wake up and realize you've become the monster you swore never to be." Magnus stepped forward, his fist clenched. "So you killed our relatives for our own good?" "I killed them to spare the world from the destruction they would bring," replied Hakon. "Each extinct Viking lineage is 1,000 innocent lives saved." "And who gave you the right to make that choice?" asked Sigrid, her hands glowing with battle magic. "Experience," replied Hakon simply. "And the weight of knowing I'm the only one who truly understands the price of power." Eric lowered his sword, a terrible idea beginning to form in his mind. "Björn Iron Black," he said slowly. "He's not just a Brotherhood member, is he?" Hakon smiled sadly. "Björn is my son, raised from birth to hate our lineage, to dedicate himself to our extinction. The final revelation left Eric dizzy. Björn, who had hunted his family, who represented everything Eric considered evil, was his nephew. "Why?" asked Eric, his voice almost a whisper. "Because someone from our family needs to survive to continue the work when I'm gone. Someone who understands the danger we represent, but who doesn't carry the burden of ancestral power." Björn, who had remained tied and silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Father," he said, his voice loaded with complex emotions. "You didn't tell me there was another." "Because I hoped I wouldn't have to tell you," replied Håkon. "But Eric is special. He carries Ragnar's direct lineage, not a secondary line like mine. The power in him is magnified." Eric looked around the chamber, at the artifacts pulsing with ancient energy, at his allies watching him with hope and fear, at the brother who had dedicated his life to fighting his own nature. "There's a third option," he said finally. "Which?" asked Håkon. "Destroy the artifacts. Break the cycle of power that corrupts our lineage. Allow Ragnar's blood to finally find peace." The suggestion was met with immediate protests from Magnus and Eirik, but Sigrid remained silent, considering Eric's words. "The artifacts are the source of the most concentrated power," she said slowly. "If they're destroyed, our abilities will diminish over generations until we're just normal humans." "And what would be the problem with that?" asked Eric. Håkon studied his younger brother with new attention. "Would you really consider giving up all that power? If it means none of us will become a monster, if it means children like Freydis will never again lose their families to the fury of Viking kings?" "Yes." Eric raised Ragnar's sword, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. "True strength isn't in accepting our destiny, but in choosing to change it. What happened next would determine not only the future of his lineage, but the fate of countless innocent lives that could be affected by the power of Ragnar's descendants." And for the first time in his life, Eric felt he was truly in control of his own destiny. Ragnar's sword vibrated in Eric's hands as if it were a living being resisting his decision. The runes along the blade glowed with increasing intensity, and he could hear whispers in ancient tongues, voices of ancestral warriors pleading for him to reconsider his choice. "Don't do this," said Magnus, his voice loaded with desperation. "We're the last of our lineage. If you destroy these artifacts, our heritage will die with us." "And maybe that's exactly what should happen," replied Eric, but his own words sounded less convincing than he expected. Håkon watched the scene with an expression mixing admiration and skepticism. "It's easy to talk about renouncing power when you still don't fully understand what you're rejecting, brother." "Then show me," challenged Eric. "Show me what happens when I fully accept my inheritance." Håkon approached the altar and touched Ragnar's crown, a circlet of black gold engraved with runes that seemed to move when no one was looking directly at them. "Put this on your head. Wield the sword. Feel the complete power of our lineage. Then tell me if you still want to destroy everything." Freydis stepped forward, panic evident in her eyes. "Eric, no. We've already seen what happens when power takes you. At the monastery ruins during the fight with the Brotherhood." "That was just a sample," interrupted Håkon. "The true transformation happens when you consciously embrace your destiny, when you stop fighting against your nature." Eric looked at the crown, feeling its magnetic attraction. Part of him yearned to put it on, to feel the complete power his blood promised. Another part screamed warnings, reminding him of the Volva's visions, Ragnar's atrocities, the pain in Freydis's eyes when she told about her dead family. "If I do this," he said slowly, "and become the monster you fear." "Will you kill me?" Sigrid exchanged a glance with Magnus and Eirik. "If necessary," she said with infinite sadness. "I will," said Freydis firmly, drawing a dagger from her sheath. "If the person I love disappears completely, I won't hesitate to kill what remains." Eric nodded, feeling strange peace in her promise. "Then let's find out who I really am." With deliberate movements, Eric placed the crown on his head and firmly wielded Ragnar's sword with both hands. The transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. Power exploded through his bones like molten lava. His vision expanded, allowing him to see not only the temple chamber, but also distant lands where armies marched, oceans where ships sailed, entire kingdoms that could bow before his will. The ancestors' voices were no longer whispers. They were roars demanding conquest, vengeance, absolute domination. Eric could feel the location of every Brotherhood of Shadows member scattered across Scandinavia, and knew he could find and destroy them all in a matter of days. More than that, he could feel the fear of Christian kings in their distant castles, the unrest of Jarls who had abandoned the old ways. All of them knew on some primordial level that Ragnar's blood had awakened again. "Yes," he whispered, and his voice echoed with divine authority. "Now I understand." Eric turned to face the group, and they instinctively stepped back. His eyes blazed with blue-silver fire, and the runes on his body pulsed like stars. He no longer seemed entirely human. "I can see everything," he said, walking around the chamber like a predator assessing prey. "Every weakness, every fear, every secret desire. Magnus, you yearn for vengeance against the Christians who killed your sister. Eric, you dream of reconquering the lands your father lost. Sigrid," he paused, smiling with cruelty he had never shown before. "Sigrid wants to kill herself to escape the burden of her lineage, but is too cowardly to do it." "Eric," said Astrid, with a trembling voice, "my son, are you still there?" Eric looked at her, and for a moment his expression softened. "Astrid, my dear adoptive mother, you always knew what I would become, didn't you? That's why you hid me, protected me, tried to keep the monster asleep." "You're not a monster," she said firmly. "You're my son." "I'm both," replied Eric. "And now I see that Hakon was wrong about one thing. Power doesn't necessarily corrupt. It just reveals who we really are beneath our pretenses of civilization." He turned to Björn, who watched him with a mixture of fascination and terror. "Nephew, your father raised you to hate me. But now I can offer you something better than hatred. Purpose. Join me, and together we'll create a world where strength determines worth, where the weak serve the strong naturally." "No," said Björn surprisingly. "My father was right about you." Eric laughed, the sound echoing in the chamber like thunder. "Your father spent 40 years running from his own nature. I don't make the same mistake." It was then that Freydis moved. The dagger in her hand glowed with its own light. Eric realized too late it was an enchanted weapon, forged specifically to wound beings of supernatural power. She launched herself at him with desperate speed, determined to fulfill her promise. But Eric was faster, much faster. His hand closed around her wrist, stopping the blade inches from his chest. For a moment they remained frozen, she pushing with all her strength, he resisting without apparent effort. "Would you really kill me?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "To save the hundreds of people you'll kill if you continue on this path?" "Yes." Eric studied her face. The determination, the love, the desperation. And for the first time since putting on the crown, he felt an emotion that wasn't thirst for power. "Pain. Freydis," he whispered, and for a moment his voice sounded human again. "I don't want to be this." "Then don't be," she replied, tears running down her cheeks. "Choose to be who you were before. Choose to be the man who protected me, who cared for Astrid, who offered forgiveness, even to his enemies." Eric looked around the chamber, at Hakon, who watched him with painful understanding, at his allies who were ready to fight against him if necessary, at Astrid, who looked at him with unconditional love despite the monster he had become. The crown weighed on his head like a mountain, and the sword burned in his hands like red-hot iron. Power whispered promises of greatness, of vengeance, of satisfaction for all the wounds he had suffered. But louder than all that, Eric heard Astrid's voice in his memory. "Remember who you chose to be, not who your blood says you must be." With a cry that echoed through the temple chambers, like the roar of a dying dragon, Eric tore the crown from his head and hurled it against the altar stones. The artifact shattered with a sound like breaking crystal, and Eric felt the supernatural power drain from his body like water from a broken dam. He fell to his knees, panting and disoriented, but human again. When he raised his eyes, he saw everyone in the chamber watching him with amazement. "The crown," whispered Hakon. "You destroyed it, and I'm going to destroy the rest too," said Eric, forcing himself to stand. "But first," he looked at his older brother. "There's a question I need to ask." "Which?" "Do you want to continue being a monster running from yourself, or do you want to try to find a better path?" Hakon remained silent for a long moment, then slowly began removing the power rings from his fingers. "Maybe it's time to discover who I can be without these burdens." Eric nodded, taking Ragnar's sword again. This time, when he touched it, he felt only echoes of power, enough to do what he needed, but not enough to corrupt. "Let's finish this," he said. "Let's break the chains our father forged and finally find peace." But even as he prepared to destroy the remaining artifacts, Eric knew the real battle wasn't over. The struggle between the man he chose to be and the monster his blood wanted him to become would be a war that would last the rest of his life, a war that, this time, he was determined to win. Dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. while Eric watched the last fragments of the ancestral artifacts dissolve in the sacred waters of Lake Mälaren. Ragnar's sword had been the last to be destroyed, its runes glowing once more before transforming into dust that the wind scattered like a blessing over the tranquil waters. Hakon stood beside him, looking younger without the weight of the power rings he had carried for decades. "Do you feel regret?" he asked, watching the last vestiges of their ancestral heritage disappearing. "Relief," replied Eric honestly. "For the first time since I discovered who I am, I feel I can breathe freely." Freydis approached, her arm naturally passing around Eric's waist. The battle in the temple had transformed them, no longer just two young people fighting against impossible circumstances, but partners united by difficult choices and love tested by fire. "What happens now?" she asked. Eric looked around the group. Sigrid, Magnus and Eirik seemed lost without the artifacts they had sought for so long, but there was a lightness in their expressions that hadn't existed before. Astrid rested against a nearby tree, finally allowing the exhaustion of recent weeks to show in her posture. Gunnar studied runes on his scroll, always the scholar. Even Björn, who was now free from his bonds, seemed to contemplate possibilities he had never considered. "Now," said Eric, "we build something new." They spent the following days in the ruins of an old abandoned farm near the lake, planning a future none of them had imagined possible. Without the artifacts, their supernatural abilities gradually diminished, making them more human each passing day. "I can no longer hear thoughts," observed Sigrid one morning, and there was gratitude in her voice. "My strength is returning to normal," added Magnus. "Yesterday I needed help to lift a stone I would have moved alone a week ago." "And the runes?" asked Astrid, examining Eric's arm. He looked at the marks that had once glowed with divine power. Now they were just pale scars, perhaps interesting to a history scholar, but devoid of the supernatural energy they had once carried. "They're silent," he said. Finally, it was Björn who brought news that the Brotherhood of Shadows was dissolving. Without the artifacts, without the threat of supernatural power returning, the Brotherhood's reason for existing disappeared, he explained. "Most members are simply going home." "And you?" asked Eric. "What will you do now that your entire life has no more purpose?" Björn considered the question for a long moment. "I spent 40 years learning to hate and destroy. Maybe it's time to learn to build." Eric smiled. "There's a village a few days' journey from here. They lost many young men in recent attacks. They could use someone experienced in protection and organization." "A simple life," murmured Björn. "I can barely imagine it." "The best lives usually are simple," said Astrid wisely. In the weeks that followed, the group gradually dispersed, each finding their own path to a normal existence. Sigrid decided to travel south, where her residual magical abilities, now limited but controlled, could help her become a respected healer. Magnus and Eric chose to establish a warrior school, teaching defensive combat techniques to protect vulnerable communities. Gunnar returned to his home village to record the true history of events, not the distorted legends that would grow with time, but the simple reality of young people choosing humanity over power. Eric and Freydis remained together, settling in a small coastal community where no one knew their true names or origin. Eric worked as a blacksmith, his hands that had once wielded divine weapons now creating tools for farmers and fishermen. Freydis became a midwife, her experiences with loss and trauma making her especially skilled at helping other women through difficult times. Astrid lived with them, her hair growing whiter, but her eyes remaining alert and loving. She never tired of telling stories to the village children, stories about heroes who chose kindness over strength, about the courage needed to give up power in the name of love. A year after the events at the temple, Eric and Freydis married in a simple ceremony by the sea. There were no magical runes or ancestral blessings, just sincere words of commitment between two people who had found each other through extraordinary circumstances and chosen to build something ordinary and beautiful together. Hakon appeared unexpectedly at the ceremony, his appearance transformed by the year of peaceful life. He had established himself as advisor to a minor jarl, using his leadership experience to help resolve disputes without violence. "Any regrets?" he asked Eric while they watched the village children playing on the beach. "None," replied Eric. "And you?" "Only the regret of taking 40 years to make the right choice." 2 years later, when Freydis gave birth to a daughter, Eric held the child in his arms and searched for any sign of the ancestral runes. There were none. The girl was completely human, free from the burdens that had haunted her lineage for generations. "What shall we call her?" asked Freydis, exhausted but radiant. Eric looked at Astrid, who watched her new granddaughter with eyes bright with happy tears. "Astrid," he said, "to honor the woman who taught me that true love means putting others' well-being above our own desires." The older Astrid smiled through her tears. "She'll have a life free from the curses of the past, a life where she can choose to be whoever she wants to be." "As it should be," agreed Eric. Years passed. Little Astrid grew strong and healthy, laughing in the beach waves and learning useful trades from her parents. She would never know that her father had once possessed power to conquer kingdoms, because that person had chosen to die so a better version could live. Eric aged gracefully, his hair graying and his hands callousing with honest work. He never regretted his choice, not even on nights when he dreamed of Viking ships cutting distant seas under banners fluttering in the wind. On his last night, when age finally caught up with him, Eric was surrounded by family. Freydis, now a middle-aged woman with wisdom engraved in every line of her face. His daughter Astrid, now adult and married to a good man from the village. And his grandchildren, who knew their grandfather only as a gentle blacksmith who told the best stories. "Any regrets?" asked Freydis softly, holding his hand as he slipped into final sleep. Eric smiled, his eyes meeting hers one last time. "Only the regret that I won't have more time to love you." He died in peace, knowing he had broken the cycle of violence that had defined his lineage for centuries. There were no monuments erected in his honor, no sagas sung about his deeds, but there was a happy family, a prosperous community, and the certainty that he had chosen love over power. Eric Ragnarsson's true legacy was found not in the blood he carried, but in the choices he made and the lives he touched. He proved that even those born for destruction can choose to create, that even the most powerful can find their greatest strength in humility. And on nights when the wind blows strong over the coastal village where he lived his final years, the inhabitants sometimes swear they can hear the echo of his laughter, carried in the waves like a blessing for all those who choose kindness over strength, love over power. Blood doesn't determine destiny. It's the choices we make in the silence of our hearts that define who we really are.